MMA fighters might act like they're willing to fight anyone, but they aren't always down to do that. It's just part of the job. From Randy Couture to Ronda Rousey, here are all the fighters who refuse to fight each other. Starting with Randy Couture. When Fedor Emelianenko came out of retirement to fight for Rizin in 2015, not many people knew they also tried getting another legend to wear gloves. For years, people talked about Randy Couture fighting the Last Emperor, and in 2015, Rizin made it happen. Apparently, Couture said that he was asked to fight Emelianenko in 2015 by a Japanese promoter, but he had to say no to the fight because he was 52 years old at the time. He'd need a lot of training and tune-up fights to do the sport justice and put on a good fight. This wasn't the first time he'd declined Emelianenko. There was a lot of talk about these two heavyweights going at it in the MMA ring in 2007.
I think, if anybody's going to knock Fedor's, when he came to the American market, he didn't compete as well as he did in the Japanese market when he was fighting for Pride, and he had all of his big fights, and I was at some of those fights. They were amazing.
And people were super hyped about it. But then, Couture wasn't interested. Back then, he had some issues with his contract and didn't feel he was getting paid enough. Plus, he was pretty nervous about going up against Emelianenko, who was pretty scary in the ring. I can't say I blame Couture for being hesitant. I mean, if I were going up against someone as fearsome as Emelianenko, I'd be sweating bullets too. Unfortunately, this decision was a bummer for those of us who were hoping to see these two giants throw down. Speaking of throwdowns, here's another fight that all of us would have loved to see, but never happened. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Georges St-Pierre. So, back in 2019, there was a lot of buzz about a possible fight between these two MMA legends. Everyone was totally hyped up about it, but then Khabib turned it down. He had some reservations about the fight, like concerns about St-Pierre's ability to make weight and the logistics involved in setting it up. Honestly, I can't say I blame him. St-Pierre's a pretty big dude, and cutting weight to fight him could be a real challenge. Plus, a lot of work goes into organizing a big fight like that, so I get why Khabib might have wanted to avoid it. They talked about how much they wanted to fight. In typical UFC style, they said no to the big fight.
In a business point of view, it makes sense because I wanted to keep Khabib active because they keep the ball rolling. They knew that if I would only come back for maybe one fight. You know what I mean? They rather keep Khabib active, I guess, and not taking the risk, and I understand that.
The main reason was that the UFC didn't want Nurmagomedov to win and St-Pierre to retire and give up the belt, as he did with the middleweight title in 2017. But after Nurmagomedov retired, they talked to him about fighting St-Pierre. He said St-Pierre wanted to fight him because Dana White texted him, but Nurmagomedov turned down the fight because he was happy to be done with fighting. Now, while we're on the subject of selling fights or trying to make them happen, here's another that just didn't happen. Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev. So, back in 2020, there was a lot of talk about a potential fight between Diaz and Chimaev, two of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. Everyone was hyped up about the idea of these two going at it in the octagon, but it turned out that Diaz wasn't interested in the fight. He had concerns about the logistics of the match, and he said he was looking for a more high-profile fight that'd be a better fit for him then. While it was disappointing for those of us who were looking forward to seeing the fight, you can't really blame Diaz for his decision. He was a veteran fighter with a lot of experience who knew what he wanted in his career. Chimaev was still a rising star in the UFC back then. Dana White did everything he could to sell the fight, but no one was interested. Diaz turned down the fight in a very public way. He even told TMZ that the UFC was being disrespectful by trying to offer that fight because Chimaev hadn't fought in the UFC in a while.
Did you watch Khamzat's fight?
Tonight? Yeah, I was watching on the warming up.
What did you make of his performance?
Lame, scared, boring, rookie, whack.
But what do you know? The UFC even tried to force these fighters to fight it out on short notice. Jon Jones versus Chael Sonnen. When Dan Henderson couldn't fight Jon Jones in the main event of UFC 151, the UFC tried to get Chael Sonnen to fight on short notice. Even though the UFC and Sonnen tried, Jones turned down the fight, so the pay-per-view was canceled. Jones turned down the fight because he didn't have enough time to prepare for Sonnen. His coaches told him not to take the fight and said taking the fight could be the biggest mistake of his career.
Oh, Chael's swarming on as Jones. Big knee. Looking to finish this fight early. All over him right here in the first round. Jon Jones has finished Chael Sonnen.
Now, here's another fight involving Georges St-Pierre that just never happened. Georges St-Pierre versus Anderson Silva. Even though UFC champions Georges St-Pierre and Anderson Silva were supposed to fight for years, it never happened. At UFC 186, the fight came the closest to happening, but St-Pierre turned it down. The fight offer came in before Silva got suspended for steroid use after failing a drug test at UFC 183. St-Pierre turned down the fight because he was already working on other things and was worried about the use of steroids in the sport. Sometimes, fighters down a fight just because they don't like the other guy enough. And that's exactly what went down between these two, Miesha Tate versus Aspen Ladd. Last year, a big fight was between Miesha Tate and Aspen Ladd. After Ladd failed to make weight for her fight with Macy Chiasson at UFC 38 in Las Vegas, the former UFC bantamweight champion said Ladd was unprofessional. Ladd challenged Tate to a fight in 2022, but Tate turned her down. Tate said no to the fight on her YouTube channel. She said she wasn't going to go through a whole training camp for a fight that might not happen because of Ladd's weight problems. Yikes. Other times, fighters agree to a fight at first, but then turn it down later.
I'm afraid that I'm going to waste an entire camp training for a fight that may very well end at the scale. Aspen Ladd has missed weight 3 times in her MMA career. If Aspen Ladd can show up, make 135 pounds, and have a good performance, then we might be talking. But until then, I'm out. It's not personal, it's professional.
Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier. After Poirier lost at UFC 269, it seems like he and Nate Diaz agreed to fight each other on Twitter. But even though the men agreed to fight, after the Diamond lost to Charles Oliveira, the Stockton native turned down the fight later that week. Diaz said on Twitter that he didn't take the fight because the UFC wasn't willing to pay him enough money to do it. This next fight was exciting because a new and upcoming fighter was going against an industry veteran, but sadly, it didn't happen. Alex Pereira versus Krzysztof Jotko. Pereira's UFC 268 debut was a big deal. He won by knockout and quickly became the talk of the UFC's middleweight division. So the UFC chose to put him up against Krzysztof Jotko, a well-known veteran fighter. Pereira turned down the fight and chose to fight Bruno Silva instead. He turned down the fight for a simple reason. He thought Jotko was a boring fighter who lied and prayed. This drop shouldn't be a surprise for someone who's known for being an action fighter. Now, I know I've only talked about male fighters so far. Here's a fight between 2 women that almost happened. Ronda Rousey versus Cris Cyborg. It was the best fight between 2 women in a long time. Their paths almost crossed in Strikeforce and then in the UFC, but it never happened. In the end, a lot of it was because Rousey didn't want to fight Cyborg for a number of different reasons. Rousey said that since she was the UFC bantamweight champion, then she shouldn't have to move up for the fight, and Cyborg should come to her. She turned down the fight because Cyborg had used steroids in the past.
Here's what it is. If you're pumped full of steroids and the lightest you can get is 145, then it's obvious that the lightest you can get without steroids.
That's all on the fighters who refuse to fight each other. See you in the next one.